This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian. It was the fall of 2016. I had just finished driving 11,000 miles across Europe and Asia, the story I told on the first season of this podcast. And now my friend Donna had flown out to eastern Siberia to join me for the trip back. I'd hardly spent any time in Russia up to this point, so I really had little idea what to expect. I mean, I guess I just had these images in my head that Siberia would be this cold, barren, and desolate tundra, unlike anywhere I had ever been before. You know, you hear about Siberia, and you think about gulags, those forced labor camps where Stalin sent political prisoners. The very word Siberia is basically synonymous with the middle of nowhere. And I suppose I was attracted by this idea of nothingness and by the unknown, because here I was in this part of the world that few tourists ever go to and to which I'd probably never return. So I was curious to see what it was like. Well, I think my hopes were too high, because Russia turned out to be a lot different and in many ways less interesting than I'd expected. Our trip 3/4 of the way across the largest country in the world would take us about 2 weeks to complete. And first of all, I found out we weren't far enough north to see any tundra. I was also surprised to learn that there was basically just a single 2-lane road across most of Russia, but it was well paved, and to be fair, there wasn't really enough traffic for there to be any need to build a proper highway. Most of it was just a long, straight, and boring stretch of blacktop that passed through forests and occasional small towns. And there were actually lots of pretty large cities in central Russia as well, like with over 1 million people. Places with names like Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, and Krasnoyarsk. But they all seemed to be like 12 or 14 hours apart from each other. So it made for some days of very long driving. I had this notion before setting out that Siberia was sort of this untouched wilderness, so I was disappointed to see that some of these cities were actually pretty dirty and polluted. Like, I remember driving through Krasnoyarsk as we left our hotel one morning, and there was this incredibly dense smog that was just absolutely gross. You could barely see ahead of you. We also passed these really ugly hot water pipes in a lot of places that were wrapped in duct tape and snaked alongside and over the roadways, and they had this kind of post-apocalyptic charm. Overall, Russia just seemed like this really complicated place, and it left me with a lot of questions. So I've decided to reach out to someone who I think can help. Charles Maynes is an American radio journalist based in Moscow, and he's on the line with me now. Thanks for joining me, Charles.
Happy to be here.
What first got you interested in Russia?
Well, you know, my parents actually were diplomats here in 1968 and 69. So for them, it was an important part of their lives. They made a lot of great friends. And I was born a little bit later in 72. But, I grew up hearing a lot about the place. And, I graduated from high school at the time that the Berlin Wall fell. And at the time when, everybody was really looking east towards the former Soviet Union, towards Eastern Europe. And that was kind of my entree in a way, or got me sort of really focused on the place.
So how did you end up moving there?
It's a long story, but I've been here over a decade in several, I guess, incarnations. I came here as a student and studied in the 90s, had kind of a wonderful / miserable time, came back again as a young reporter and worked here for a couple of years. Some point left and thought I was done with it. Ended up getting a grant, or applying for a grant, I should say, to come back, where I connected with a group of Russians who were running, I guess, one of Russia's first podcasting websites. It was a mixed success and or failure, depending on how you looked at it, but it was a fun time. And I guess since 2012, I've been reporting primarily for public radio, for some other global, I guess, outlets, and doing some podcasting work as well.
I have a pretty clear memory of the first time I entered Russia. It was when I was on the Mongol Rally back in 2016. It was on the first half of my journey when I was driving with my brother on the way to Mongolia. And actually, I think we actually might have still been in Kazakhstan at the time, but we were pretty close to the Russian border. We were stopped at this traffic light, and this guy next to us rolled down his window, and he called out, "Akudate, where are you from?" Now, we'd gotten that question a lot up to this point, and, even though the vast majority of people we met were friendly, I never knew just how they'd respond. So I'd been trying to encourage my brother to tell people New York, because, everyone likes New York. But he forgot in this case, and he proudly said America. And this guy gave us a thumbs down, and he said, Obama bad, Putin good. Then the light changed, and he pulled away from us like, he was in a drag race, and my brother looked at me, and he's like, whoa. I know this kind of might be an impossible question to answer since, you're living in this country with more than 140 million people, but I'm curious from your observations what you think the average Russian thinks of Americans these days and whether that's changed over time from the era of Obama to the era of Trump.
Well, the average Russian, I think they do focus on America a lot. I think that Russia is very focused on America, and maybe too much so. But in terms of their attitudes towards Americans, I find it, it depends on the person. A lot of it depends, frankly, on their media diet. If there's someone who spends a lot of time on state media where the U.S. is quite demonized, then maybe their attitudes are a bit more negative. If they're more diverse media diet, I find basically they're quite open. But, people are people. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I feel like, here when I talk to people, whether they're from Moscow, whether they're from, far regions of Siberia, people generally tend to be pretty curious about people from other parts of the world, people who come to their country who, if you speak Russian in particular, then I think it offers, more of a chance to kind of break down those walls. But, that said, Obama was not well loved by Russians, and Trump was seen as someone who was very friendly towards Russia. If you want to dip into, as we talk, there's the impeachment scandal kind of unfolding and the impeachment hearings. From the Russian perspective, Trump was always projected to them as someone who said, why can't we get along with Russia? Which, of course, sounds nice to Russians.
What kind of interactions do you have with people when they meet you for the first time and they find out you're from the U.S.?
Well, I can kind of switch hit at this point. I think people find that when they first meet me, they don't pick up right away that I'm from the U.S., but after a little while, unless I volunteer the information. So that maybe plays a role, but, I think people tend to want to ask about, I guess the standard question is like, how's it over there, compared to here? And so they always kind of want to do this one-to-one comparison, and the polite answer is, of course, it's interesting here and it's interesting there. And but I think there are some big differences, of course, in terms of the way these societies are set up and the way people live. One of the big differences, if you talk about the regions of Russia, which is where you were, is that, the U.S. has, I would argue anyway, that these second, third tier cities, I'll put that in quotation marks, are much more comfortable places to live than maybe the cities where everyone seems to, quote, want to live. Some place like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, they're fantastic cities, but they're expensive. And so I think the quality of life in a Minneapolis is probably a lot nicer in some ways than other places. That's not the case in Russia, where all the concentration of wealth is in Moscow, and a lot of the rest of the country is kind of left to rot. These second-tier cities like Novosibirsk, like Ekaterinburg, they're making their way, but even talking to friends who are from there, they say that there are no jobs, and of course they're all looking for ways to move to Moscow. So that's a big difference. But in other ways, I would say that Russians and Americans are strangely similar, and we both have these large countries. We're slightly inward-looking. We don't tend to speak a lot of other languages, and we both have this kind of love-hate relationship with Europe, where we sort of admire but resent them at the same time. So I think in some ways, Russians and Americans really are more similar than they realize.
There was this strange thing I noticed pretty early on in my journey across Russia that I wanted to ask you about. I was driving back across Siberia with my friend Donna in this kind of ridiculous-looking clown car. I had just completed this 11,000-mile rally, so the car had all kinds of stickers and writing on it, and, you couldn't miss us. And in pretty much every other country we went, people noticed us. Like in Iran, they rolled down their windows on the highway to ask where we were from, where we were going. Driving through small villages in Tajikistan, the little kids stood on the side of the road and stuck out their arms to give us high fives as we passed. But in Russia, with a few rare exceptions, like that guy I told you about a few minutes ago, no one seemed to notice or care.
Huh.
People just mostly seem to be in their own worlds.
Right.
Like it didn't seem like a normal human reaction to not even wonder who are these weird people in their crazy car and what's their story. And I say this as someone who grew up in the New York area, because you see all sorts of things riding on the New York City subway, and it often takes something pretty extreme to get people here to raise an eyebrow. But even by New Yorker standards, people's lack of reaction in Russia just kind of struck me as odd. And maybe you're used to this living in Russia, but how do you explain it?
Yeah, it's funny. It's true. Russians tend to be, they have a poker face, kind of a street face, which they don't interact with strangers unless they have to. And one of the things that took a lot of getting used to for me when I came here was that, kind of used to the American style where you sort of try and gauge people a little bit on eye to eye and say hello or whatever it might be. And, from the Russian perspective, when they're on the street, they're just getting from point A to point B. I find Russians on the street are a little bit cold, but once you're actually inside in a Russian's apartment, it's a totally different story. So once you cross that threshold, everything seems to change. So I can remember, even living in my apartment building here in Moscow, or actually my previous apartment where I was living, where, my neighbor, I would pass him on the street. He was this kind of gruff Russian guy. I'd pass him on the street. He wouldn't say hello. We'd pass in the stairwell, in basically right outside the hallway where we lived. And he lived right across from me. And he wouldn't meet my eye. He'd just keep his head down. And after, I think, 4 years, we finally got to the point where we'd sort of whisper which is kind of a, just a quick greeting, like hello, but without making eye contact. And there were times when he would look at me, but he would look right through me. It was like you didn't exist. And I find that is true on the streets of Russia quite often. I always wondered if in some ways it had something to do with a society where people spied on one another, where, it was hard to create your own internal life, and you only trusted your own friends. So conversations are saved for the apartment, for the kitchen in particular, during Soviet days. And I think there's some carryover of that.
Wow. So I want to tell you about this guy that my friend Donna and I met on our trip. After, spending about a week in Russia, we wanted a change of scenery. So we decided to head south, cross the border, and continue part of our journey on the Kazakh side. And I should remind listeners that Kazakhstan, of course, used to be part of the Soviet Union. So the two countries still have pretty close ties, and the people share a lot in common in terms of culture and politics. We spent a day or two in the capital, Astana, and then on our way back north, we stopped in this lake resort town that our guidebook had kind of funnily described as the Switzerland of Kazakhstan. But it was late September, so it was, the off-season for tourism, and the town was, kind of dead. Donna was having some problems with her back. She said she really needed a massage, and I was like, well, good luck finding that here in the middle of Kazakhstan. We didn't have hotel reservations, so we were driving around that evening looking for somewhere to stay. We stopped at a few places, and Donna didn't like them for one reason or another. And then we came to this place that looked, slightly sketchy from the outside. It had like a neon light in the window, and Donna joked that it kind of looked like the Bates Motel. So it didn't seem very promising, but we figured, okay, we have nothing to lose. So I sat in the car while Donna ran in to check it out. And she came back 5 minutes later, and she said, well, the place is empty. The woman behind the counter only spoke a few words of English and wasn't very friendly. Wasn't exactly trying to lure our business.
Yeah.
But there was a guy there who spoke really good English, and he was telling me all about the place, and you're not going to believe this, but he's the on-staff masseuse. And not only that, but he'd gotten his training at Wat Po in Bangkok, which is like the top masseuse school in the world. And we were like, what were the chances? This sounds incredible. We found our place. So we check in. Turns out the hotel also has a swimming pool, a sauna, even a 2-lane bowling alley. It was just like totally random. And so the masseuse's his name was Nicky. He gave us massages and a complete spa treatment. And he was a nice guy, but while he was, giving us the massages, he engaged in small talk, and he turned out to have all sorts of kind of strong political opinions that kind of surprised us. And then the next day, he led us on a hike through the woods, and as we walked, he had some more really interesting and eye-opening things to say, so I took out my recorder. Basically, he was born in 1974, so he spent most of his childhood and teenage years living under communism, and now he was sort of lamenting how much things had changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Before, we don't care about money.
He said that in the old days, no one cared about money, and they didn't understand capitalism.
Children go to school.
Kids went to school for free, they didn't have to pay for their books, and even the universities in Moscow had free tuition.
We don't need to pay for studies.
He also said that
And
food used to be more
every
natural
food,
without
have
any
some
additives
milk,
and nothing was artificial.
original meat, potato, mushroom. Now we don't have even milk original.
He blamed
And
capitalism
because
for what he said
people
was a
know
rise in
better. If you ask
prostitution and
something,
more
oh,
crime.
Now all apartment, all home closed still because have criminal.
Everything's locked. There's more security
somebody, yes,
because there's more crime than there used
before
to be.
nobody closed door,
So from his point of view, the only downsides to communism were that people couldn't travel freely and they didn't have blue jeans.
We don't have modern fashion.
But he
Just
said
only
that's
need
all
this.
we needed.
No need change system.
They shouldn't have changed the whole system. How common is this sentiment that people in Russia and other former Soviet republics say they miss the way things used to be?
It's common. I think there is a certain amount of nostalgia that's crept in the past 20 years. A lot of it result of the 1990s, frankly, when there was so much economic chaos. I think a lot of people feel that it's very hard to get ahead these days, that the rules are stacked against them. And, so you do hear this from lots of people that they seem to remember the better parts of life in the Soviet Union, which is, of course, the social safety net, this free education that he mentions, this kind of lack of materialism that was in the fabric of society just because things didn't exist. Though friends of mine will actively counter that and say, well, yeah, but they don't talk about the fact that you couldn't speak your mind and you couldn't, read what you wanted or listen to what you wanted. Those aspects seem to have kind of fallen to the wayside as people have focused on, other problems of current life.
So the more I spoke to Nicky, the more I was kind of taken aback by some of the things he said. Like I mentioned, he was actually Kazakh, but he seemed really eager to defend Russia at every opportunity. In fact, I even forgot when I was speaking to him that he wasn't Russian himself. And he had some views about politics and democracy that I'd never heard before.
In America, people cannot choose. Everybody thinks have democratic country, but this is not true.
What do you mean people can't choose?
You think you choose Hillary or
president,
Donald Trump,
right.
You choose some party, but in America have just only the same family, same,
Right.
I don't know, Rockefeller or who control Wall Street.
Well, what about in Russia? Do you feel like you have a big choice when there's elections?
No need too much choice. Russia no need some democratic. This no need, because you know why? Better stay same king. This is more better for people.
Better to keep the same ruler.
That sounds really familiar to me.
Yeah, I was wondering. You hear that kind of thing from a lot of people?
Yeah, there's an intense cynicism that's developed in these countries of the former Soviet Union over the past 20 years, 25 years. And I would guess that if you talk to Nicky in 1994, 5, 6, 7, something like that, he would have a very, very different view. But you've seen this evolution in a lot of people from the Soviet Union where they're so disillusioned with the idea of democracy. In fact, they call it demokratia, becomes demonstratia. So when he's like shitocracy, the idea that clans and cabals run the whole show, which, maybe doesn't sound too far from what, I don't know, I guess a Trump supporter might think in 2016 as they cast their vote for Donald Trump to try and kind of break the wheel. And this idea also that, stability comes from one single ruler. I mean, with Vladimir Putin, he's been in power now for going on 20 years. And, there are people who clamor for change, but one of the strong selling points has always been, stability. And even among people who are not super enthusiastic about Putin, they're worried about who might come after him. And the idea is not so much that they have this grand, hope that Putin will make things better and better. I think they've kind of gotten over that, but they're worried that someone like a Yeltsin would come in and make things worse. And even just, I guess, anecdotally, I see people who come and visit Russia from the West, from Western countries. In some ways, they're very impressed. It's very easy for the Russians, I think, to impress on certain levels for big events, something like the World Cup or the Olympics, minus the doping issues. But the Russians, once they kind of put their minds to something, it's an autocratic system that can clear the way to suddenly build high-speed trains from one city to another or erect a stadium in, seemingly a few months. These are the kind of things where, I go back to Washington, D.C., and this is where I grew up, and it's been 25 years, and they still can't get the metro built out to Dulles Airport. I don't understand why. This kind of thing. So in some ways, these democratic societies are are so kind of riven with infighting that they can't seem to kind of just take care of business. And that's one of the advantages, unfortunately, of an autocratic system.
And he said some other kind of really strange, to me at least, things, and some things that were even kind of downright offensive. Like he criticized, U.S. military interventions, which is totally fair, but then he claimed Russia never invades other countries. So I said, well, what about Ukraine? And he responded by comparing Ukraine to a cheap lady, a prostitute. He said that Russia had every right to go into Crimea. And then we had this odd conversation back in the hotel lobby where he basically said, Russian history goes way, way back. Look at all the literature and treasures that have come out of that culture. Meanwhile, what has America ever given to the world?
What do you think American culture have something interesting? For example, French culture.
I'm not sure what you're looking like. What does French culture have?
French for kitchen, for the eat.
Oh, the kitchen, food.
Kitchen, yes.
Yeah. Well, America's not known for its food, really.
No,
we have hamburgers and apple pie.
Something good in America. What do you think? What's something good? What?
I don't generally think of myself as the patriotic flag-waving type, but, suddenly I was in this awkward situation where I felt like I was being put on the spot and asked to defend my country's honor.
What is good about America? I think people are very hardworking.
But this is not culture.
No. Besides food, Hollywood, the movies from America. There's a lot of cultural things that are unique to America, a lot of the music and the entertainment,
I didn't seem to be convincing him. What about the Japanese, he asked. They've got geishas, samurais, ninjas.
Well, America, there's jazz music is from America.
Jazz is for another culture.
But it's from America originally. That's where it started.
Yes.
There's baseball. That's from America. Sports,
I think, in America before have mafia, after have black people. Just how many years? 50 years have freedom or?
Since segregation ended in the 1950s, 60s.
Before this.
Oh, God. Yeah, that also sounds really familiar to me.
Does it really? Yeah, that's just so crazy to me that when I think of America, I think of Hollywood, jazz music, and baseball. But when Nikki thinks of America, the first things that come to mind are the mafia and segregation.
Yeah. I mean, part of it, of course, is that, Russian culture, these are older societies than ours, right? So, they'll point to old churches here and say, that's 1,000 years, old. What were you doing then in the U.S.? And I say, oh, we didn't exist. So U.S. is a young country, and I think some ways the dominance of American pop culture, causes a resentment among other countries which have their own rich history, like Russia, like France. So in a way, it makes sense to me. I think some of these other issues that he raises, with, when he thinks of mafia or, say, segregation, this is also something that the Soviets and Russians, if we pull forward to today, they really, this is part of this whataboutism argument that you hear, which is that, when we criticize the Russian government, say, for human rights violations or something that's happening in Chechnya or something like that, they would point to, what about, police violence against blacks? And during the Soviet period, it used to be, but you hang blacks. So this was always part of the kind of arsenal of arguments as you were promoting one society to the other, as they were wont to do, particularly during the Cold War.
Okay, so let's move on from Nikki. I feel like we've heard enough from him, and I also want to kind of...
I like this guy, though.
You like him? He's a very fascinating guy. But I also want to get to some actual Russians. So after about 2 weeks of driving across Russia, I finally arrived in Moscow in early October of 2016. And as a side note, this was just a month before Trump was elected. And I remember walking by the headquarters of the FSB, the Russian Security Service, which, if people don't know, is kind of like the modern-day version of the KGB. And it was only many months later that I realized that just behind the walls of that building, a team of computer hackers may have been hard at work while I was there, interfering in the upcoming U.S. presidential election, which now seems kind of creepy. But anyway, I met these two girls, Arzu and Ina, who were college students and who agreed to show me around the city. And as we walked through the noisy downtown area, we had this fascinating conversation about some of the cultural differences between Russians and Americans.
I know that American people, they're very open-minded and always can ask you, how are you fine, and be very polite. But in Russia, maybe sometimes they're more serious and not so open-minded. But, they can be real. I don't know, especially if you go to someone's house and you drink tea or just eat something, people are ready to propose you everything that's in their kitchen, really.
You need to break the initial ice. Once you break the ice and you become their friends.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That is what I mean.
Yes.
The difference between Russians and Americans, in my opinion, that Russians are more like thinking, like if I need to trust this person or not. But in America, everyone is like...
They're more trusting.
Yes, more trusting. But on the whole, I think people are not so rude or mean. They are friendly.
They're friendly. It's just very different than what we're used to, and it seems
Yeah.
cold and unfriendly the way we perceive it, you know. Yes.
Yes.
As you could hear, they seem to be well aware that many of us in the West have this stereotype of Russians, that they tend to be gloomy and they never laugh. So I asked them to describe more of how things look from their perspective in terms of what Russians think of Americans. They told me they're taking an American studies course in their university, and one of the most memorable classes was when they had an American woman come as a guest lecturer.
And she said that in America, everyone smiles, even if they don't want to smile. I mean, they can be fake a little bit. Yes, so you can say, oh, you can come at my house, we'll meet, but they
don't really mean it.
Yes, they don't really want it and mean it. It just they're trying to be nice
Right.
and something like that. In Russia, people are like more
Honest.
Yes, honest. If they don't want, they will say sorry. I mean, I don't want you to come, and they won't be fake. And if they don't want to smile, they don't smile.
Yes, I agree with Arzu. I like smiling a lot, but when I see the people who smile all the time, it's very strange for me. It's a little bit tiring at first, and secondly, it's very difficult for me to understand.
So, Charles, what was the biggest bit of culture shock that you had when you first moved to Russia?
That's a good question. I think they put their finger on something, which is that, you know, Americans tend to kind of open up avenues for conversations with people by being friendly, by being sort of open. And Russians don't operate that way. So some of the kind of standard toolkits for making friends just kind of don't work, you know, to a certain degree. I mean, I just feel like, you know, Americans have kind of mastered this small talk approach, the hey, how are you kind of stuff. Russians don't do that. They tend to kind of think that this sort of American style of quick conversation on the street with a friendly smile is very phony, fake, or from their perspective, even kind of stupid, that you're sort of inviting, you know, freaks to kind of come up to you, which is what I find happens to me a lot, frankly, still.
And all these things, I think it seems like it would take a while to get used to. And I found it hard as myself, just kind of dropping in, you know, being there for a short time.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest, you know, I think I went to Russia with an open mind, but I kind of just wasn't feeling it.
Really?
You know, on a cultural level, the people didn't seem as friendly or engaging as they were in many of the other countries I've been. So I didn't feel terribly welcome.
That's interesting. You know, I just started to jump in, but thinking about conversations I've had with other people too, I know people who have spent a significant amount of time here or in Ukraine or in other parts of the former Soviet Union, what they now call the CIS, and they've expressed similar thoughts. They said, you know, we were here for 6 months, you know, we met some nice people, they were friendly, but no one ever invited us over. Nobody, you know, we just didn't have that kind of connection we were looking for. What I find interesting here too is someone who's lived here for a while, I think that there is something where, you know, Russians, for example, if you speak no Russian, in some ways the world opens up to you more than once you start to learn the language, in the sense that Russians are eager to kind of, maybe it's to practice their own English, but they want to show you around, they want to do things with you. I felt as though the more I got to learn the culture and the language, you start to realize how big the hole is that you're digging. So, you know, you would find that, you know, you no longer got the sort of guest treatment, you know, which was nice. I mean, I have to say it was nice when people treated me like I was special. That felt good. And then the longer I was here, they're like, okay, you're not special. So
Interesting.
So, you know, for me, it was, maybe it's the opposite. I don't know. But, you know, Russians are, I mean, I find them just, you know, they're frank and they're funny. And these days it's funny when I go back to the US, I find that, okay, I do think that Russians a little bit, you know, too cold on the street. And, I think it would maybe be useful for the society to be just a little bit nicer to one another from time to time. At the same time, when I go back to the U.S. and, the neighbors want to chat and you can't walk out your door without sort of being plucked over by a neighbor or something, that, that makes me think that maybe that's a little bit too much the other direction too.
But even aside from the seeming coldness of the people and the lack of customer service, there were several other things that really kind of bothered me. Like even the simplest of tasks seemed so annoyingly bureaucratic. A lot of places that we saw on our trip, some of these second-tier cities that you spoke about were really bleak and run down and depressing. Also, I have to admit, I'm a big foodie, and I know it's a cliche, but much of what I ate in Russia wasn't very exciting, even compared to meals I had just across the border in Ukraine, where things seem to have way more flavor.
Right.
I hate to be so down on Russia, so I'm eager to hear what you like about the country and what's kept you there all these years.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm here working as a journalist, so a lot of it is, I think the Russian story is a really fascinating one. In broad outlines, I think people understand a little bit about the Soviet Union. They understand about the idea of sort of this democratic Russia emerging and how that's shifted course a little bit under Putin, particularly over the last 20 years. It's a fascinating place to be. It's a huge country with beautiful landscape. So, just imagine if the flight from Moscow to New York is 10 and a half hours, I think if you go direct. You can still fly from Moscow to the other end of Russia for 10 and a half hours. It's that big. So it's been a really fun experience for me to travel around the country, whether it's in the far north or the far east or different places to kind of see it. So I enjoy that part of the, adventure of it. I find that, Moscow as a city is a strangely nice place to be. When I was a student here, it was kind of notoriously uncomfortable. I've never been in a place that sort of puts you under that much pressure all the time, made you feel kind of small. But what's strange is that even though the politics these days are quite nasty, the city itself has become really comfortable to live in. So, I live in the center of the city. It's they've invested very heavily in the park system here. There's a kind of a booming restaurant scene. I agree with you that maybe traditional Russian food isn't always the best, but there's some highlights of it. And also you've seen this kind of culinary culture kind of prop up here over the last 10 years in particular that's been kind of incredible. So even in the face of sanctions that's prevented, say, Western European cheeses from being imported into Russia, you have this insane, variety that certainly didn't exist when I was here in the 90s. So all these things kind of play a role in making the place kind of very interesting. I think that Russian culture is really fascinating, whether you're talking about the art or music scene. I think one of the things that's sort of strange about Russia is that you have, in some ways, this very static political scene, one leader in charge for 20 years. At the same time, you have a lot of stuff bubbling under the surface that makes it really interesting.
If I were to ever return to Russia, where should I go, or what should be some of the experiences you'd recommend I seek out to try to change my perspective?
Well, I would start, it sounds like, with the food. So come find me. We'll go and try some good food. I think that might be a start. I think if you wanted to show someone some of the diversity here, the art scene here is pretty dynamic. And also the political art. I think that's another thing, that everything seems very charged here in a way. It's funny, when I used to describe it, I don't know if it still applies these days, but when I first got here, I used to say that, Russia was like opera. It was like full of heroes and villains. And that's what kind of made it so dramatic all the time. And so you were kind of living in this larger than life saga. And, these days it's a little bit tamped down, but it creeps up in strange moments and you still feel it.
Okay, well, Charles Maynes is an American journalist based in Moscow. His work has appeared on public radio, including This American Life, 99% Invisible, The World, and the BBC. And along with my colleague Julia Barton, he also produced a fascinating radio documentary series a few months ago about space bridges, these futuristic satellite video links between Soviets and Americans aimed at creating peace during the Cold War. You can check that out on Radiotopia's Showcase podcast. Charles, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Scott. This was super fun.
Remember, you could follow Far From Home on Instagram or Facebook, or follow me, Scott Gurian, on Twitter. And if you like the show, please tell a friend. Thanks as always to the Public Radio Exchange for podcast hosting and technical support. My Season 2 logo comes from Polemic, which designs award-winning experiences all over the world at the intersection of culture, commerce, and community. Find out how they could help your business at polemicdesign.com. My credit music comes from violinist David Shulman. If you like it, you could check out more of his work at his website, quietlifemotel.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.